When I came to Newark as a bona fide kid of the 1960s, there was this strong emphasis on really making a difference or giving back or pulling people out of dire circumstances. I mean, what better place to have that kind of experience than a city that I live in, and a city that I care about, and a city that I've studied. I'm a native of a great old American city. I'm a native of Washington, D.C. And having an urban experience early in life, there was simply no reason for me to leave a city. But more to the point, I just find Newark a very convenient city, given my lifestyle. I'm close to where I work. I'm close to the things that I care about, and that would be people and institutions that do good work. I'm close to the Newark Airport, the Penn Station, the Newark Public Library. I think the best place to begin to form an image of Newark is downtown, probably Broad Street. It's one of the great streets in New Jersey, and I think it's probably one of the great streets in America because, again, the city's so old. If you're on Broad Street or if you're on any of the downtown streets, you're walking along old American ground. You can see churches of an architectural style you will never see again. You can see great old commercial venues, such as the old Bamberger's department store building, which still stands. You have 3 parks, 2 of which go back to colonial times. And you have this kind of hustle and bustle that defies the popular image of a city like Newark, where nothing much goes on here. So I think a walk down Broad Street would work as far as forming an image of Newark is concerned. Newark is a very important American city, probably because of its age. It's the 3rd oldest city in the Union, and also because of its narrative. Here's a city that has this great upward trajectory from the early 19th century on to the mid 20th century, and seemingly lost its way and became the city that many American urbanites, and especially American suburbanites, felt they wanted to despise. And more recently, you have a city that shows an enormous tenacity and a willingness to recover from the past. So in studying Newark, we Americans, whether we're black or ethnic white, whether we're of long standing in the American Republic, or whether we're a 1st or 2nd generation immigrant, in studying Newark and coming to know Newark, coming to feel Newark, we come to know a lot about our civilization. Newark's ascent to a great American city, and I think it happens around the 19-teens and 1920s. That's Newark's golden age. Right after that golden age, something happens in this country that makes the Newarks of America all the more problematic, all the more misunderstood would be a better word. And that is the beginning of suburbanization. New Jersey was once the most urbanized state in the Union, and by the 1960s, certainly by the 1970s, it became the most suburbanized state in the Union. And that transformation from cities to suburbs, from old neighborhoods to new subdivisions, from the ethnic narrative in the city to the 2nd, 3rd generation ethnic narrative in the suburbs, contributed to Newark's, if you will, falling off the radar screen of American civilization. I think that happens around the early to mid 1960s. The early American cities tended to be river towns, but there was no better location for a city, with the possible exception of New York City. I can't think of a better location for a city than Newark, because the Passaic River enabled the city to become a great industrial city, and also the location of Newark, so close to New York, somewhat close to Philadelphia, not very far from Boston. You know, Newark is a part of this northeastern corridor of cities and towns. And Newark is, if you just look at the map of the United States, Newark is almost right smack dab in the middle of one of the richest veins of creativity, productivity, human diversity that we have in the United States. And it's benefited from that. In fact, I think that what ultimately matters at the end of the day for Newark's present and near future, taking nothing away from the talent of its citizens and its leadership, is its location. The location is perfect for a city that's trying to rebound from some of the misdeeds of the past. The river linked Newark with another great smaller city, Passaic, farther north, and the river also linked Newark with the Morris Canal, which was built or completed in 1832 and connected Newark with the hinterland leading to the Delaware River. In the 20th century, Newark became yet another transportation hub because of the railroad, and later because of the airport, and around that time because of Port Newark. So again, one of the things that really matters in Newark's past and in its increasingly bright future is its location to very close transportation facilities, and it serves as a hub. Gus Henningberg says it best. He says there's a spot on the New Jersey Turnpike where most of the major transportation networking, at least along the East Coast, comes together. And that place is within the confines of Newark. So I think that the fact that you can get to Newark from any place emboldens this city's imagination of its connectiveness to any place. And all the more, I think, the immigrant population that we're seeing, emerging in Newark, is the result of the daily flights in and out of Newark International Airport. The river does not matter in the same way that it mattered, say, up until the late 19th century. In other words, it's no longer a conveyor for industrial products. However, it matters almost as a spiritual reference. Most American cities, Baltimore, Cleveland most readily come to mind, Washington, D.C., Alexandria, Virginia, St. Louis, Cincinnati. All of these towns are enjoying the same thing that Newark enjoys, and that's a resurgence in their image, a resurgence in their self-identity, because they have rediscovered the river. So the river almost frames the city spiritually. It's almost, if you can go back, or when we're able to go back and walk along the banks of the Passaic River, that will connect us spiritually to the Lenape Indians who fished that river. That will connect us spiritually to the Euro-American pioneers who came here, Robert Treat and that band that he brought to Newark. And it'll also connect us to the 19th century, in which Newark's industrial progress actually set the stage for Newark's 20th century demise. Newark has had a long bout with public health issues because of the river, and in the 20th century, because it couldn't handle so many people who had so many needs. So it's almost, the river provides a kind of a grounding of how the city got its start and what the city needs to do to reconcile the mistakes of the past with what we now know about a wholesome urban life. And I look forward to the day when there is a walking trail along the Passaic and a bike trail, and there are plantings. I even imagine one day being on the Passaic River, which there are plans to restore boating to the river, and that will take us truly back to the 19th century, and that's a good thing. The New Jersey Performing Arts Center was the last major performing arts venue built in the United States in the 20th century, which means that by the time NJPAC opened in 1996, we Americans really knew what a performing arts center could mean to a city. Secondly, when then Governor Kane and subsequent governors got behind the construction, the idea and the construction of NJPAC, they challenged the notion that Newark was not an appropriate site for such an ambitious project. And I think it's fair to say that since 1996, NJPAC has succeeded in recalibrating the image of downtown Newark. It has help raise all boats associated with Newark's progress. It has succeeded in doing something which was actually an original objective, and that's to at least slow down the drain of resources and money and interesting people who went into Manhattan for their urban experience, completely bypassing Newark. And I think that borders on a very important development that mattered for Newark's image and also for the image of New Jersey. The other thing that NJPAC has done, it has challenged a traditional notion of race relations in Newark, and that is the traditional image of whites and blacks being divided in neighborhoods, divided in their imaginations about the city. NJPAC, not unlike the Newark Museum, not unlike Rutgers-Newark, not unlike the galleries that are taking shape, has become a ground for civic interaction and civic discourse. And the last time that happened in Newark was the early 20th century, when the Newark Public Library had opened not too long ago, and the Newark Museum opened in the early 1920s. So one century, one long problematic century after Newark's golden era, we seem to be entering into an era, I don't know if I'd call it golden, but I would call it enlightened and optimistic. Newark in many ways mimicked New York, and maybe still does. Why does a city, which was essentially a smokestack city, have a museum of the quality of Newark's Newark Museum? And more recently, why does a city that statistically is one of the poorest cities in the United States have a performing arts venue having the stature of the New Jersey Performing Arts Center? Or why does a city that doesn't have many jazz emporia have the nation's finest jazz station, FM, 24 hours a day, WBGO? What I'm getting to is that Newark is a very pragmatic city. Newark realizes historically, and even now, realizes where it is, and whatever New York has, Newark wants a good version of that. I think the classic example of that would probably be WBGO, and this is very personal. That great jazz station went on the air around the time the New York City, the great New York City, where the Count Basie Band and the Duke Ellington Band and Jimmy Dorsey, all these great jazz ensembles played. New York's jazz station becomes a country and western station around the time the WBGO goes jazz. And there's an interesting pragmatism in that kind of opportunistic attempt by a guy by the name of Bob Ottenhoff, who started a NPR station in Newark that plays predominantly jazz music. Newark is a part of that tide of Southern creative people who settle in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, New York City, Boston, where jazz gets its early 20th century beginnings. Also in Newark, between the 1930s and the 1960s, Newark is the site for the Savoy Record Company. And that was a record company that recorded and produced many of the jazz musicians that gave jazz its international reach, most notably Charlie Parker, but there are others. So there are two things going on. Newark is a destination for creative people who happen to be instrumentalists, and Newark is a place where the most significant thing in jazz's history occurs on a large scale, the production of records. And that's the reason why this is a jazz town. I might just add that according to Duke Ellington, Newark had the distinction of being a sophisticated jazz city in that when the Ellington band, and Ellington was not the only band, Ellington's band was not the only one to come to Newark. Lucky Millender's band came to Newark. The Count Basie band came to Newark. The Dorsey band came to Newark. But Ellington said that when the band came to Newark, it knew that it was entering a city of very serious jazz listeners, maybe even jazz aficionados. And that becomes a part of Newark's culture. Maybe it's because this is a working class city. And a woman and a man's wages are very important, and you don't trifle with a working class city where its citizens, its residents are putting down their money to hear the Count Basie band. The band must be at the top of its game, and there's kind of a grittiness to Newark, an authenticity, a seriousness of purpose. The true founders of what is now Newark were Lenape Indians, and much more needs to be known and felt about their long involvement in this part of North America. But the narrative that most people are truly interested in would be what occurred here in the middle of the 17th century, when a small band of Puritans from Connecticut, led, it would seem, by Robert Treat, settled on the banks of the Passaic River, negotiated with the Lenape Indians, and began the Euro-American, if you will, domination of this part of what was becoming British North America. And every succeeding generation of Newarkers tends to become less and less like the Puritans, with one great exception. Most of the people who come to Newark, with the exception of the African slaves who were brought here in the 17th and 18th centuries, came here to improve their condition. So Newark is a part of that American dream of success, that American dream of uplift. And of course, in the 20th century, the African-American narrative changes because a lot of black people come to Newark to escape the rather dire circumstances of their daily lives in the South. So Newark, again, performs this function as a beacon of hope and opportunity. And I think that's what's going on now in Newark. The people who are coming from the Portuguese-speaking diaspora, the people who are coming here from the Caribbean and Latin America, they're coming here to begin an American life which they hope will be more rewarding than the lives they left from wherever they come from. Newark is a city, and has been since its colonial Euro-American inception. It's a city that has been forged by immigrants, whether those immigrants were coming from Connecticut, Puritans, or whether we're talking about the English settlers or the Scotch-Irish or the Irish and Germans of the 19th century, or the African Americans of the 20th century. Every era of Newark has been deeply punctuated by recent immigrants who changed the character of the city, changed the civic behavior of the city, changed its politics. And I argue that as long as Newark is receiving immigrants, as it is now, this city's future is relatively bright. There was a time from roughly 1970 to around 2000 when Newark was losing large numbers of people, probably to the suburbs, maybe to retirement places in South Jersey or the American South. If you look at the 2000 census and compare it to the 1990 census, Newark only loses about 10,000 people, which suggests that although people are still moving out, a significant number of people are moving in, and those new immigrants are coming from Brazil, coming from Angola, Portugal, Haiti, Ghana, Ecuador, Puerto Rico, and other places, other diasporas, if you will, are finding their way to Newark, and I think that's very exciting. If you take a long view of Newark, whenever Newark is receiving new immigrants, the city is going to change, and the change is going to be an exciting one. I'm always reminded of the influx of Italians and Jews into Newark in the late 19th, early 20th century. The settlement of those two large ethnic groups contributed to Newark's culture, contributed to the labor force. It was during that period that Newark became a more cosmopolitan and, yes, a more ethnically enriched city. I think we might be going through something like that in the early part of the 21st century. Newark is a part of that tide of southern creative people who settle in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, New York City, Boston, where jazz gets its early 20th century beginnings. Also in Newark, between the 1930s and the 1960s, Newark is the site for the Savoy Record Company. And that was a record company that recorded and produced many of the jazz musicians that gave jazz its international reach, most notably Charlie Parker, but there are others. So there are two things going on. Newark is a destination for creative people who happen to be instrumentalists, and Newark is a place where the most significant thing in jazz's history occurs on a large scale, the production of records. And that's the reason why this is a jazz town. I might just add that according to Duke Ellington, Newark had the distinction of being a sophisticated jazz city in that when the Ellington band, and Ellington was not the only band, Ellington's band was not the only one to come to Newark. Lucky Millender's band came to Newark. The Count Basie band came to Newark. The Dorsey band came to Newark. But Ellington said that when the band came to Newark, it knew that it was entering a city of very serious jazz listeners, maybe even jazz aficionados. And that becomes a part of Newark's culture. Maybe it's because this is a working class city. And a woman and a man's wages are very important, and you don't trifle with a working class city where its citizens, its residents are putting down their money to hear the Count Basie band. The band must be at the top of its game, and there's kind of a grittiness to Newark, an authenticity, a seriousness of purpose. One of the things that fascinates me about Newark is the kind of the tightness of Newark, the well knitted quality, especially of Newark's 20th century history, through the first half of the 20th century, these tightly knit neighborhoods, such as the Weequahic section, or the Clinton Hill section, or the Third Ward, or the First Ward. In other words, under the shadows cast by New York, people in Newark had remarkably productive, vital lives. Buildings such as churches and synagogues enable what might be called the mystic chords of memory. That's an old Lincoln-esque reference to how and why we remember. Some years ago, I did a tour of Jewish Newark, and we went to old B'nai Jeshurun, wonderful edifice, now an African-American Baptist church. And as we were going up the steps to this temple, now church, I was walking next to a guy of my generation, and I started bragging about the what he was about to see in this sanctuary. And he says, "No, I've been here before. I was bar mitzvahed here." And I could tell that his memory was being engaged by steps he probably hadn't walked up 10, 15, 20 years. So spaces that are preserved really do trigger memories of our youth, of people who have departed this life, places such as places that very precious ceremonies, such as a bar mitzvah, can be reconsidered, reevaluated, remembered on a more mature level. I might just add that Newark not only has buildings that engage the memory, but it also has public spaces. A lot of people are re-engaging Newark through its park system. I mean, Newark has over 40 parks, 2 of which are large county parks that used to serve as the countryside for working class families. If you were a poor Italian, or a poor Jew, or a poor Pole, or Hungarian in Newark in the 1930s, 1940s, you wouldn't go to Martha's Vineyard for your vacation, for your fantasy in the hinterland. You would go to Branchbrook Park, or you would go to Weequahic Park, or West Side Park. So these spaces that have been preserved and these buildings that still exist enabled people who used to be in the city to reconnect to the city. And also, we hope that these buildings and these spaces will serve that function for future generations of people who are now, if you will, coming of age in Newark. And that's very, very important to me as a citizen. When I think of my own experience with becoming a citizen, I think of my school, I think of my library, I think of the public park. This is where the daily business of citizenship is learned. And Newark has a lot of these spaces, and I think it's fair to say that the city has rediscovered the value of its historic architectural legacies. I'm very much taken with the architectural integrity of some of the 19th century places of labor and places of residence in the city of Newark. In terms of labor, most unfortunately, many of these buildings are no longer around, and those that are still around are in need of rehabilitation, but they are still around. The one that I'm most fascinated with would be the Murphy building in the Down Neck section of Newark. But then you have a pretty impressive array of 19th century late Victorian buildings in Newark, including the Ballantyne House, which is very carefully protected by the Newark Museum. You have an array of buildings, 19th century buildings along Mount Prospect Avenue, the Crane Mansion, which now serves as the headquarters of the North Ward Cultural Center. You have Lincoln Park, which is a late Victorian community on the southern end of Broad Street that is remarkably intact, and the buildings have been well cared for over the years. That part of Newark is where I live. And then there are also some absolutely spectacular houses of worship, some built in the late 19th century, others in the early 20th century. Every denomination that I know of in Newark that was here at the turn of the last century seemingly made a point of using architecture to say something about their faith. Whether you're talking about the Basilica of the Sacred Heart, which is arguably one of the finest buildings or houses of worship in North America, or the Jewish synagogues that you find along Old High Street or Martin Luther King Boulevard, or the synagogues that you find along Elizabeth Avenue and Clinton Avenue, or the African American churches that you find in certain parts of the city. Architecture gives groups an opportunity to express themselves artistically, not only for their period, but for future generations. And although Newark has lost a lot of its architectural legacy through very, very poor planning, I think that enough is here to give us a sense of how rich this city was when these buildings were built, and how enriched the city is by their preservation. The future of Newark will probably be quite different from its distant and more recent past. This is no longer a smokestack city. This is no longer a city of small factories and machine shops. This is no longer the centerpiece of New Jersey. As I said before, New Jersey is a suburban state, no longer an urban state. However, the future will depend on two things. One, the willingness of younger people to become urbanites. In fact, one of the important roles that Rutgers University is playing is drawing a lot of young people to Newark for academic work, for study and research, and all that can happen on a university campus. And we are hoping that some of those students and some members of the faculty will make, if you will, a life decision to stay put and help the city to recover. The other thing that's likely to mark Newark's future is a different kind of diversity. This city is going to become all the more a immigrant city. In fact, what's happening in Newark is very reminiscent to what happened in the early 20th century when you had these first generation people coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, and first generation Northern black people entering Newark from the American South. Now, as a historian, I must say this: whenever immigrants come into a place, they re-energize the place. I mean, look at what's happened to towns like, New York City and Newark and Philadelphia and Washington, D.C., cities that have been rejuvenated because of the settlement of new immigrants who are willing to work hard, willing to send their kids to the local school down the street, willing to buy a house. One of the interesting things about Newark, quite frankly, taking nothing away from the wonderful work that we're doing at Rutgers University and the number of other institutions of higher learning, one of the most exciting things going on in Newark right now is the construction of new housing in every section of the city, in the Down Neck section, in the Central Ward. The Central Ward looks completely different than it did, say, 20, 25 years ago. Every ward, every neighborhood of the city has these little filler houses, some with some interesting conceits like green space or a carport or an address. In my travels in Newark in the spring, I find a lot of people in Newark, people of moderate means, have planted their yards. And for reasons I can't quite figure out, Newark is becoming a rose city, not unlike Madison, New Jersey. A lot of people prefer rose bushes in their front yards and their side yards. And it's quite lovely to be in Newark in the spring. We do know that the best thing to happen to Newark since I've been a resident of this old American town is that the cynicism associated with the late 1960s and early 1970s is largely a thing of the past. And there's almost like a restoration of Newark's headiness and enthusiasm and optimism. And that is, I think, increasingly shared by people who live in the city, study in the city, and work in the city, and people who don't live here. I am increasingly called upon to lead tours of Newark by people who haven't been to this city in 20 to 40 years, and they want to give Newark a second look. They tend to be white. They tend to be safely ensconced in the middle class, and they tend to be older people who remember what they perceive to be the good old days of Newark. And when I ask them about the good old days, they will mention the 40s and the 50s. As a historian, those were hardly good old days. Those were actually the days in which Newark was beginning its long slide into the problems of the late 1960s. So we'll have to stay tuned as to how memory will factor into Newark's history. But I'm less worried about that. I'm less worried about memory being a negative now than I was some years ago. It may be that the long memory of Newark's near rendezvous with disaster, and that's what I call the riots, affects people who haven't been here in a while. And one of the things that the university serves, one of the purposes that the university serves, along with these other institutions, is they're magnets, kind of like drawing people back into the city, encouraging people to take a second look at the city. So I think, it's hard to predict the future, but I think in the near future, the riots or the disorders or the breakdown in civic order is what I increasingly prefer to call the summer of 1967. That will be rendered to memory by people who are increasingly getting older, and the work of historians. Newark, unlike other American cities, has experienced a precipitous decline in low-level street crime, which means that the city is safer and it feels safer. One of the greatest deterrents to crime is, in fact, people on the streets. So when you drive through my neighborhood, people are out. When you drive through the Ironbound section, people are in the streets. Weekway, Clinton Hill, this is no longer a city bereft of humanity on the paved roads and sidewalks of Newark. And I must again emphasize this, what might be called these ceremonial evenings. And it's important that Newark has a nightlife now. The Newark Museum recently had an exhibition, Nicholas and Alexandra, works of art and clothing and photographs from the last Tsar and his family of Russia. The exhibition exceeded all forecasts for visitation. Thousands of people, thousands, most of whom were not Newarkers, many of whom were not New Jerseyans, came to see an exhibition. The volume would suggest that it only takes something that you can't find anywhere else to entice people to come into a city that I think has been unfortunately constructed in the American imagination as off-putting and foreboding. The turning of that corner, I think, began 20 years ago, and we just about have made it from what I can see. And again, to cite the role of Rutgers-Newark, I mean, I've been on the faculty long enough to remember the days when many members of the faculty thought that no self-respecting parent would send their kid to Rutgers-Newark. We haven't had that. We haven't had that belief in many, many years. Quite the contrary, we now see our enrollment being the highest it's ever been, and that's a good Newark story too. Higher education is a very exciting industry. It gives people hope. It fosters interaction across culture lines and gender lines and social class lines. I well remember my very distinguished colleague Judy Brodsky imagining Newark in the late 1970s, early 1980s as a college town. Well, in fact, there is a considerable collegiate community in Newark, which makes Newark just that, a college town. And the interaction of these college communities with the city of Newark, I think, is the highest now than it's ever been, at least in the 35 years that I've been on the Rutgers faculty in Newark. A significant number of my colleagues on the faculty research Newark in the social sciences, in the humanities, in the arts. And the same can be said the same holds true for faculty members at NJIT and Essex County College and the University of Medicine and Dentistry. The third important feature of these collegiate communities, and there are 5 of them, is that they give Newark a reputation for having very smart people engaged in the work of democratic life. Our society really became a better society when higher education was made available to a cross-section of the rank and file. And of course, I'm speaking of the GI Bill. Now, we no longer have a GI Bill, but we have state institutions, such as Rutgers in Newark, that make it available for people of modest means, but exceptional ambition and exceptional goals to come to an old American city and have a bona fide urban experience and get a very, very good education. I'm excited to bear witness to the just fascination of the human experience. To walk down Ferry Street, for example, on a Saturday morning, and to hear Portuguese, to see the older Portuguese men performing very much a European ritual of talking whatever Portuguese men talk about on Saturday mornings. I find it fascinating. Or the array of Brazilian restaurants that have cropped up over the last half a decade. Or going to the northern tier of the city and hearing not just Spanish, but Spanish spoken by people from different, if you will, cultural backgrounds of the Spanish-speaking diaspora. or contending with, for the first time since the, I would say since the 18th century, late 18th century, an African-born population. We haven't had Africans of, if you will, direct African ancestry in Newark for well over 200 years. And I find it fascinating. Or to hop a cab in Newark, and you can talk to a cab driver who can bring you up to date on what's going on in Haiti, in Port-au-Prince. This panorama of cultures and sects and sectarians, if you love cities, you really would come to love the variety, the diversity, the energy of these immigrant groups. At Rutgers University, I'm now officially a senior member of the faculty. And I remember walking across the plaza, which is now known as the Norman Samuels Plaza. In the old days, you would walk across that plaza and you would mainly interact or cross paths with black or white students and some brown students. That old imagery has been replaced by a rich array of colors and languages and accents and dress, and I am just so absolutely fascinated with the gentle complexity, the gentle richness of Rutgers-Newark. It may be one of the most international zones in New Jersey, our campus, and I think that speaks well of Rutgers and also speaks well of Newark being able to handle that kind of diversity.